Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Big Easy Sports Talk podcast. My name is Nick Garisco, and I'm here with Michael Pelicans. Today, we're analyzing Saints draft picks. We're discussing the NBA lottery next week, and we're going to be mixing it up today. We're going to talk a little Kentucky Derby. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, if you like what you hear today, please subscribe to this podcast and give us a great rating on iTunes. You can follow us on all social media at B.E.S.T Podcast NOLA. Michael, let's jump into the NBA lottery. It's next week. It's on Tuesday, May 14th at 7:30 p.m. on ESPN. And the Pelicans have about a 6% chance of getting the first pick. What do you think the most likely scenario is for the Pelicans?
I think the most important thing is to look at a range of picks rather than just individual picks. So if you look at individual picks, the most likely scenario that we have is to draft 8th. So that's basically for one team to jump us in the lottery and then for us not to be in the lottery. And that's about a 37% chance. But what that's saying, though, is that there's also a 63% chance that we would land elsewhere. So if you look at it on a cumulative basis, we have about a 26% chance to land in the top 4. And then after that, that would mean that we would have a 74% chance to land outside of the top 4. So more than likely, we're not getting a lottery pick. So that's fine. That's not the end of the world. I think we'd still wind up in a pretty good spot because of that. So I think that's the way that you should look at all these things.
When you say we're not getting a lottery pick, can you kind of tell the audience what that means?
Yeah, sure. So basically the lottery is done for the top 4 picks. Traditionally, or at least since the new system had been implemented, it had been for the top 3. And this is actually the first year that they're shifting to the top 4. So what they do is each team has a certain percentage chance of landing in the top 4. And so they're drawing lottery balls, these combinations, and then each team is assigned these combinations. And so what happens is once the top 4 is set, the teams that are remaining are set in the reverse order of the standings. So it's really only done for the top 4 picks.
Gotcha. So if the Pelicans did not land a top 4 pick, we actually would want the teams who are projected to get top 4 picks to land ahead of us. Is that right? Is that fair to say?
Correct. It's basically any team. So it's those teams and then any team who finished worse than us in the standings. So because we have technically, again, we have a tie with 2 other teams, but because we are 7th, so to speak, the 6 teams in front of us in the lottery odds, as long as they stay in front of us, then we would stand at 7.
Yeah, we don't want any surprises like the Los Angeles Lakers getting the top pick. We want teams like the New York Knicks, the Cleveland Cavaliers, Phoenix Suns, Chicago Bulls, and Atlanta Hawks, Washington Wizards, too, are all the teams in front of us. And so if we don't land a top 4 pick, we want those teams in front of us to end up ahead of us. That way, after the top 4 is set by the lottery, then when it goes in reverse order, we'll be closer to the lottery than we would be if, a team like Los Angeles or Memphis jumped ahead of us, because then they have to put more teams in front of us, right?
That's correct. Yeah. So the one thing that I would caveat that with is that we talked about this, I think, a few podcasts ago, is maybe a team like the Lakers or someone else who would actually want to trade for Davis getting that top pick, then there's a possibility that we would be transferred that top pick. So besides that, yes, absolutely, we would not want teams jumping us if we did not land into the lottery.
This is kind of off tangent, but I am really curious, and I know that we've talked about it before, but I just keep reading different things on the New York Knicks, and they are projected by some to get Kevin Durant. They are projected, which I think is a possibility, especially if he wins another championship this year with Golden State. I do think he could go to the Knicks and try to be the guy there. And Kyrie Irving is another one that they could try to recruit there for New York. So let's say they land 1 or 2 of those stars, and then they end up landing the top spot in the lottery. Do you think that makes them, if they land Durant and Kyrie, for example, do you think that makes them more likely to deal for AD? Or do you think that makes them pretty set with their team, and then maybe they'll just stick with Zion Williamson there at number 1 overall if they get that opportunity? What do you think they would do in terms of AD for Zion, kind of straight up, if you will?
I think if you're talking about Durant, so I think you're correct in that both of those are possibilities, whether it's Kyrie or Durant going to New York. I think if Durant went there, I think there's an almost certainty that they would prefer to trade that for AD than to keep Zion. And again, that's not because Zion's not a great prospect. He's an incredible prospect. But, so was AD when he came out. And AD has already shown himself to be a top 10 NBA player at worst. So if you're talking about building a contender, it's very, very rare for guys to step into the NBA and immediately be a superstar. And it's almost unprecedented. I'd say LeBron was really, really good right away. But typically, even the top prospects, we're projecting them at maybe 50 or 60. And so you're not winning with them immediately. You're not winning with them fairly quickly. So with that in mind, I think that someone like Durant comes there. Durant's not going to be Durant's great, and he still has several years left ahead of him where he's going to be a great player. But they would want to win now. So, and someone like Kyrie, I probably think the same thing. I think it would be not as important to win right away as it would with someone like Durant. But I think either way, that first pick, if they get Durant or Kyrie, I think they would be definitely willing to at least consider trading Davis, getting Davis for that top pick.
That's kind of what I'm rooting for, actually, now that you put it that way. If you're pretty confident, let's say more likely than not that they would deal Zion if they have Kevin Durant on the team, then that's a realistic scenario where they could easily get Durant and they could easily get the number 1 overall pick. In fact, they'll have at least tied for the best odds to do so. And I really want Zion Williamson to be a Pelican more than the other. We've seen a lot of other potential trades floated around for AD. But if we can get Zion for AD, man, that's something that I'm really going to go for there. And so I'll be rooting for that to happen just because, like you said, it sounds like the Pelicans only really have like a 6% shot to get the number 1 overall pick. But wouldn't you say that the chances of Durant going there and them trading us Zion for AD is more than 6%? Is that more likely?
I think so.
I know it's two things that have to happen, but yeah, that seems more likely to me. So that's kind of what I'm rooting for there. Is there any team like Cleveland or Phoenix or Chicago, if they land with the number 1 overall pick and have the chance to draft Zion Williamson, is there any chance that they would make a deal for AD with the Pelicans?
You could convince me. So we had talked about Chicago before, and I think I don't want to overstate the hometown thing. I think people who are in cities often say, oh, it's a hometown guy, we should get him no matter what. And I think that's a somewhat played storyline. But I do think that I wouldn't be surprised if Chicago, given their assets and given the fact that they do have a high chance at a top pick, that they would want to put something together for Davis. I wouldn't be shocked. I think the Knicks are a much more likely scenario. I think if the Lakers, with their 2% chance, got the top pick, I think that would be given for Davis pretty quickly, given that New York wouldn't be giving a better pick or whatever. But, I think that those are possibilities. And those are the 3 teams that I think are the most likely. I don't think someone like Phoenix, God forbid they did that because their franchise is in disarray and they have no reason to do that. So, look, I'm not going to pretend that Phoenix is a logical franchise, but I'd say that the 3 most likely scenarios are the Knicks, then the Lakers, and then the Chicago, given that they have a chance at a top pick. So,
man, the fans would freak out if Los Angeles, who probably has a 2% chance of getting the top overall pick, and ended up with the top overall pick. They would be screaming that it's rigged there. But let's we talked about Zion Williamson a lot, and I think that. I don't follow the NBA draft circle as much as I follow the NFL draft, obviously, but it seems to me like there's Zion Williamson's probably going to go number 1 overall, and it seems to me like Ja Morant's going to go 2 overall. But let's say we don't end up with one of those 2 elite prospects. And, at that point, I'm sure teams have a lot of different prospects, higher on their board. It's kind of, I wouldn't say it's a crapshoot after 2 overall, but I do think that there are several players you can make the argument for 3 through 10 at this point based on what I'm reading. So what are we kind of looking for as the Pelicans? Let's say we end up with the spot that we're projected to, like the 6th or 7th spot. What kind of qualities are we looking for in a draft prospect for the Pelicans?
I think it depends on how quickly they want to approach winning. Something that we had done previously that kind of hurt us is once we had Davis and figured out how good he was going to be, we went into this young veteran sort of mentality where we basically got Drew, Tyreek Evans. We were looking to basically have a team that could both win somewhat now and then also had the upside to become something really great. Now, you could argue that could have turned out a lot better if not for a lot of injuries and a lot of bad luck, but you don't want to rush a rebuild. So I think a lot depends on what their long-term plans for Drew are, what kind of haul they get for AD. So I think it's sort of a nuanced question, but I do think that, to your original question, I do think that you would be looking for some specific skill sets that you would look for in any top pick, and that's the ability to create off the dribble. I think you're seeing more now than ever how important it is to have really, really good perimeter players, not to knock big men. I think big men are actually more of a luxury at this point in terms of traditional bigs. I think it's more important for your team to have a really, really good perimeter player than it is a really, really good big man, because perimeter players tend to have the ball in their hands more. I think that a big man is a luxury. I think they can put you over the top, but I think having a really, really good perimeter player is just more pivotal to team success at this point.
And we're not one of those teams that's really we're going to take the best player available, right? We're not one of those teams that has a couple of big men that we can throw out there that we feel really confident in. And we also don't have really perimeter players. I know, Peyton might stay, and I know Drew Holiday's a good player, but he has his limitations in terms of shooting and the three-pointers. So it seems like we have needs everywhere, and our kind of draft needs, if you will, won't prevent us from taking whoever we have the highest rated player on our board is.
Yeah, I think in general, most of the teams at near the top of the NBA draft tend to have, like you're saying, a lot of team needs. So you're really looking for the best players available. And one of the beautiful things about today's game is because it is so perimeter oriented, it is actually really easy. Players who are perimeter players tend to be malleable if they can shoot. So if a player can shoot, move the ball, and defend multiple positions, you can put a lot of players like that in one lineup. It's not so siloed like it used to be, where players are a position. Players tend to float between positions in the NBA today, besides traditional bigs. So, like you're saying, you're looking for the best player, and I think there will be players there. Look, they won't. Let's just say we do land at 7 or 8, we could potentially get a star, but those players will also have the possibility of becoming, decent players, or players who are rotation players, but not guys that are stars, and that could also be busts.
Right, like J.J. Redick's of the world, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, those guys can contribute. There's nothing wrong with those kinds of players. You're hoping, especially given, let's pretend that Davis is gone, that certainly seems to be the most likely scenario. You're looking for someone to take that mantle. Drew is great, but Drew's not winning a championship here within 2 or 3 years. And at some point, he'll probably have to go somewhere else. So, I mean, you're looking for someone else to become the face of the franchise, and you're looking through the trade with AD, and you're also looking through the prospect that we would get here if we keep our pick, which I think we will. But
hey, we haven't talked about this yet on the pod, actually. What do you make of the new GM saying that he wants to keep Anthony Davis around? I know a lot of that is just kind of coach speak, potentially, because it happens in the NFL too all the time. But just the Cardinals the other day before the draft was like, I don't really know if we're going to take Kyler Murray number 1. We haven't really decided that yet. And they obviously had. And then right after the draft, Coach Cliff Kingsbury, the guy who basically was the reason that Murray went number 1 in the draft, he just said, well, I don't know if Murray's going to start opening day. I don't know if he's going to be our starter, but obviously he is. So I know some of this is just kind of conjecture, and I wouldn't go as far as BS, but just kind of keeping every option on the table so it doesn't come back to bite him, I guess. But what do you make of his comments? Is there any validity to them, or do you think that it's all just kind of maybe smoke to drive up AD's trade value?
I think other teams have to see that. So I guess I should give my answer first. I think it's mostly smoke. First of all, Griffin is a guy who has a PR background, so someone who knows how to control the message, and that's part of the reason he was brought in. I think that I'm not calling him a liar. I think that the most likely scenario is that Davis is gone. I think there's a small part of me, a very, very small part of me. This is not a strong possibility in my eyes, but I think that he might make a pitch to someone like Kyrie, a pitch to someone else who would come here. I mean, because they still do have Drew and AD, so it's not like we're bereft of talent. But I think largely it's just a leverage play, like you were saying. I think they're trying to say, oh, we're not for sure going to trade Davis, and then I think it's somewhat of a. Again, I think it's most likely that they do get rid of him, so I think it's mostly just smoke.
So the top 3 picks, projected picks, or I should say the top 3 teams. Actually, I really should say the bottom 3 teams. Excuse me: the New York Knicks, the Cleveland Cavaliers, and the Phoenix Suns. This is the first year, I believe, that they all have the same odds for the number 1 overall pick. Is that right? Or has it been like that for 2 years?
No, you're correct. So it used to be 25% chance for the worst team. So now it's for...
Dang, that's a lot.
Yeah, so they knocked it down 11% from where it was. So it's the Knicks, Cavs, and Suns all have a 14% chance for the first, but they actually all have the exact same lottery odds for all 4 spots. Now, after that, obviously the Knicks had the worst record, so if they don't get the lottery pick, then they're the team that would go fifth.
The Knicks will go first.
Exactly. So they're fifth.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the difference. But, I mean, and even the 4th team, which is the Bulls, they have a 12.5% chance. And then the Hawks are the 10.5%. So they're all, I mean, those top 4 or 5 teams are all very close in terms of their odds for the first pick.
Right. So there's probably going to be a drop-off for the Pelicans if the Pelicans don't end up in the lottery. Like, for example, if we don't end up in the top 4, it seems likely that we're probably going to be picking, 7th or 8th as opposed to 5th or 6th. I know it's tough to say, and it's all percentages right now, but it's what are our chances right now of landing in that top 4?
So top 4 pick is 26.2%. We actually can't even land 5th or 6th. So we actually don't have any possibility of landing 5th or 6th.
Yeah.
So you're correct. So if we don't go in the top 4, then we're basically, I mean, the odds are that we're going to be 7, 8, or 9, just depending on who jumps us.
That's interesting.
It's really, I mean, we're talking about some pretty small odds. So let's go in order. So let's just say we don't land in the lottery. We have a 19.7% chance at 7th, a 37% chance. Well, 37.2% chance of 8th, 15.1% chance of 9, and then 1.6% chance of 10. And there's actually like a tiny, it registers as 0 if you round to 3 decimals, but there's a tiny chance that 4 teams jump us. Yeah, but it's
in this ridiculous scenario, then we could land with 11th pick. But that's our floor, though.
Correct.
But realistically, 10 is our floor from a realistic standpoint.
Really, yeah.
So that's interesting. So we do have a massive, not a massive drop off. We have a 2 or 3 pick drop off if we don't land in the lottery, and we have a 26% chance of landing in the lottery. Thank you for giving me all those stats, because that really actually helped me put kind of percentages on these picks to see what happened. I'm very interested now, to see what really happens in the NBA, because in this NBA lottery, which again is Tuesday on ESPN, a week from today. I think that obviously there's the interest with who goes number 1, who's going to get Zion, who goes number 2, who gets Ja Morant. But also, not only if we don't get number 1 or don't land number 1 or 2, does that team potentially want to trade trade for Anthony Davis, and then maybe we do get Zion there. So it's kind of a double play for the lottery, and also, it's interesting to see if we don't land in the lottery, if we're going to end up with 7, 8, 9, or 10. So pretty interesting stuff. Really fascinating, honestly, if you're a percentages guy for the lottery. But let's move on to the Saints draft picks. And Michael, the Saints traded up for their 2 first selections in this draft. Remember, we did not have a first-round pick because of the Marcus Davenport trade. And so we had a late second-round pick. Our first pick in the draft was supposed to be 62 overall. And we actually traded up to the middle of the second round. We kind of moved up with Miami, and we selected a center, Eric McCoy. And McCoy is supposed to replace Max Unger, who, longtime Saint. We got him in the Jimmy Graham deal. He retired this offseason, a little unexpectedly, I would say, but he's been dealing with injuries for the last 3 years. But anyway, we had a void at center, and the Saints really, really liked Eric McCoy. And quite frankly, he shouldn't have fallen that far to middle of round 2. I actually had McCoy projected to the Baltimore Ravens at 22 overall in round 1. And he fell to mid-round 2 in the 40s, and the Saints just had to pounce because with the need that we had in interior offensive line. I was a huge fan of this pick. Michael, what did you think about it?
I think there's a possibility that they're looking. I think if memory serves me correctly, this is a guy who is a center, but who can play multiple positions on the interior. I think that's really great.
Right.
I mean, I think that's the kind of stuff that you would want, because I think we saw what happened. I mean, this is not the interior line, but we saw what happened when our tackles got hurt. So, I mean, like that to me was a really big deal, and I think you need to have some sort of continuity with the players that you're putting out there. And so I'm wondering if this is sort of they picked up another guy who was a multi-positional
Nick Easton.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. So I mean, to me, like it seems like they're trying to address the offensive line on the interior with players that they can plug and play, and this might be exactly that.
Right, and Andrus Peat, our left guard, is also entering the final year of his contract. So the Saints definitely need to address the interior offensive line, and you're right, Nick Easton is kind of a versatile guy. You can play guard or center. I think that the Saints, this is kind of the debate right now. We're starting him at center to start training camp and mini camp and all that. I think that the Saints really did draft McCoy to play center for Drew Brees. I really do. I think that he was literally drafted to replace Max Unger. I know that he has the versatility there, and a lot of people are talking about him, potentially playing guard if that's a better fit, and maybe it's going to be a competition with Nick Easton. Who's better at center? Who's better at guard? I think it's going to end up being Eric McCoy at center. McCoy is your classic plug-and-play starter. I mean, he is a guy, he's 6'3", 303, 33-inch arms, which is, about right for a center. He bench pressed 29 times at the combine. He actually had a 31-inch vertical, which is pretty impressive for somebody his size, 303 pounds, again, that he weighed in at the combine. I watched 3 of his games after the Saints drafted him. The lower body strength is what really kind of stands out to me. Ample strength in his core and glutes. He's got a very, very thick lower half. You can kind of see it. He's got tree trunks for legs. It's really difficult to watch these defensive tackles try to get a bull rush on him. He really doesn't get pushed around there, and he kind of plays with great leverage. I think that he also has great hand technique, which is something you're going to see from a guy who has made 38 starts in college. So this is a guy who basically started all 4 years. So that's a lot of experience. And again, stocky, powerful build. I don't think he has, although he does anchor well, and I do think he's very strong in his lower half, I don't think he has I don't think he has a lot of length. I don't really see him reaching out to hit players very well. But that was really the only weakness I could kind of see in the 3 games that I watched. And remember, this is all about need too. I mean, the Saints had a lot of issues guarding Fletcher Cox in that divisional round against the Philadelphia Eagles in the playoffs. And then the next round we lost to the Los Angeles Rams, and they obviously have Aaron Donald, the best defensive player in football. And the Saints had a lot of issues kind of guarding Fletcher Cox and Aaron Donald. So it's good that they fortified the interior offensive line. Again, this is a great value. I mean, this is the guy that I had as a late first-round pick, and I think the Saints did as well. And we were aggressive. We know the window is now, and we were able to move up and grab him at pick in the 40s, a place that he really shouldn't have fallen to. And I think a lot of teams after the fact would agree with, the Saints got great value on that pick. Another pick that I thought the Saints got a great value in, and that was Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. Yeah, he got a hyphenated name there. He's a safety out of Florida. And the Saints did not have a third-round pick in this draft. And I should mention in the Eric McCoy trade that we did send next year's second-rounder to Miami to trade up. So we do not have a second-rounder last year. But, hey, the last time we sent a future second-rounder was for Alvin Kamara. So, you never know. So, but we traded up to get Chauncey Gardner-Johnson as well. And this is a guy who is a team captain. He's 5'10", 210, and he kind of blazed in the 40 for a safety, 4.48 40, and 17 reps on the bench and 36-inch vert. So it's another guy who had a great combine. And watching him, my impression of him was that this guy is a real hustle player. I mean, he is really all over the field, and he's got great burst. He has a lot of range. He changes direction really easily. I didn't think that his tackling was that. If I have to say a negative, I didn't think he was he had a lot of hard hits, Michael, like a lot of tough hits, like tone-setting hits, kind of a guy who can lay the lumber there. But I thought he was a little careless with his tackling. I thought he kind of tried a little too hard to kind of, get that Madden hit stick on somebody, if you will. And sometimes he would leave his feet and he would completely whiff on tackles. Again, I only watched 4 film cut-ups of him. So it's tough to get the whole picture of him as a player, but in some of the games I watched, he would leave his feet a lot when he would go to tackle and kind of try to get that huge hit there. But man, can this guy cover, Michael? I mean, he's got great hips. He backpedals really smoothly. He's very twitchy, as they like to say, really good athlete. And he also is, I love when I know this is less important for a defensive back and it's more important for linebackers. But I love when I'm watching film, Michael, and I see a guy who's able to shed blockers, who, he diagnoses the play, and then he'll have to get through, what I like to call trash. Like he's got to get through trash to go end up being in position to make play. And sometimes that's, jumping over a player, who might have tried to low cut you. Sometimes it's just shifting left and right or faking out a blocker. Sometimes it's just using your speed to, get the blocker who's trying to block you to take a bad angle. But this guy is really good at kind of shedding blockers in order to make the hit. And again, versatility here. The Saints got another versatile player. He's a guy who can play in the nickel. He has a nickel back, which is basically a 12th starter now for defense. Nickel backs play like 66% of the snaps. And he's also a guy who can play strong safety. He's very, very similar to Von Bell, but I think he's actually a better cover player than Von Bell. Michael, what were your thoughts on any initial thoughts? Or additional thoughts on the pick here?
Well, I'm wondering about his size. I mean, I don't know if this is a big deal, but 5'10", it's not a huge guy, and he's already 210. That's not a huge. I know it's not as big as they used to be in terms of defensive backs because people are faster. They throw more, but I mean, if he's going to be matching up with a tight end at all at any point, obviously they might not draw it up that way, but I mean. The next guy we would talk about is 6'4" and 250 pounds. I mean, you're giving up 40 pounds and you're giving up 6 inches. So, I mean, is that a concern at all for you, or is that something that you're not worried about?
I definitely think you can make the argument that he's under. I think his weight is fine. You can make the argument that he's a little undersized from a height perspective, and he will be matched up on tight end. So it's a good point. I don't think you're wrong to make that assertion. He definitely will be matched up on tight ends. I think for the long run, honestly, I think that this kind of show Von Bell is entering the final year in his deal, I believe. And if it's not the final year, the Saints will have to make a decision in the next 2 years whether they want to re-sign him. And I think the writing is on the wall that we're probably going to let Von Bell walk in free agency. So this is, even though he's a 4th-round pick, and more than half of 4th-round picks do not pan out, right? This is a guy who really kind of, I think, is going to be here for the long run, to be honest. Not only do I think he's going to start immediately at nickelback or at least be a third safety, but I think he's going to be Von Bell's replacement. So we're going to have him for a while. And, he will be covering tight ends, but he'll also be covering slot receivers, and a lot of slot receivers aren't nearly as tall as tight ends. So he's a guy that his coverage skills will allow him to make up for his lack of height. Obviously I wish he was 6 foot, but I think he's going to be a really good player for the Saints. I was really pumped with the first 2 picks that the Saints got in this draft. We didn't have a lot of draft capital, and I'm not just saying this because I'm a Saints fan. I mean, even from an objective standpoint, these are 2 guys that we got great value on, Michael. This is a guy that, I mentioned Eric McCoy fell to the mid-second round, and, I had projected at 22 overall. Well, I had Chauncey Gardner-Johnson going 53 overall in my second-round mock, and we got him at pick 105 in the 4th round. And the reason, some of my friends have asked me, why is this guy's that good? If he's really a second-round talent, which I really do believe he is. I think he's the 2nd or 3rd best safety in this entire draft. But if he's that good and he should have gone in the 2nd round, mid-second round, as you say, why did he fall to the 4th? And the answer to that is that I've heard, at least, that he had some shaky combine interviews. I think a lot of teams interviewed him for the combine, and they didn't really like the way he portrayed himself. I don't know if the Saints were one of those teams. It's tough to say because they didn't have a third-round pick, so it's tough to say whether they would have passed him in the third or, if they had a late second, if they would have stayed at late second, if they would have passed him. But I've heard he had some shaky combine interviews. But it's worth noting, this guy was a team captain, so I'm not too concerned about it. I think it's one of the situations where teams might have really overthought themselves, and I was pretty pumped with the Saints' top 2 picks.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about Mac, because I'm curious most about him, because I feel like for a few years now we really haven't had an awesome tight end. I mean, do you feel like he's someone who's going to come in and get time right away? You talked about 2 tight end sets a while ago with the Patriots kind of starting that trend, but I mean, do you think that something's going to happen? You think he'll wind up getting a lot of snaps? Or where do you kind of see him going?
I don't see Mac getting a lot of snaps in his rookie years because, as I've talked about before, tight ends are one of the slowest positions to develop in the NFL along with cornerbacks. Even the elite tight ends in the league do not have good rookie years. It takes them 2 or 3 years to develop. But, that's why we got Jared Cook. That's why we signed Jared Cook. Jared Cook's going to start for the Saints. I do think Mac will get some playing time, assuming he makes the team. Now, I'm glad you mentioned Mac because the Saints had 3 other draft picks. They had Saquon Hampton, safety out of Rutgers. They had Caden Ellis, who's a linebacker out of Idaho. And these kind of seem like special teamers to me. And, maybe they'll make the roster. Maybe they won't. They were both 6th-round picks. But Mac was picked in the 7th round. But I did want to focus on him because he's my 3rd favorite pick of this draft. And not only because I think that, we got great value for Mac, which we definitely did. Mac is another guy who I thought should have gone in the 5th or I would even argue 4th round that really fell. I don't know why he fell to the 7th round. I really have no explanation for that. But this is a natural athlete catching the football. And he's not a great blocker, so we're not going to mistake him for, Rob Gronkowski or anything like that, this dual threat tight end. But he does give effort while blocking in the games that I watched. I watched 3 games of Mac. There was 2 games that I was very impressed with him. And then the Michigan game, I thought he really struggled in the Michigan game. And I was like, okay, well, that kind of makes sense why he's a 7th-round pick. But the other 2 games I watched, this guy looked like a 3rd-round pick, I would argue. And really, again, more good measurables from the combine. 6'4", 250, great size for a tight end. 4.7 40, probably average speed, I would say, for a move tight end. 36-inch vertical and 22 reps on the bench. So this guy's strong. He can jump high. He's got good measurables. I think that there are some, when you're blocking, he gave good effort, but I think there's some strength issues there, particularly in his legs. But, I don't know that for sure. I've never seen the guy really work out. But it just kind of seems like I think he could be a better blocker. If he got some more functional strength, I would say. But this guy's all about his receiving, though, Michael. This guy has strong hands. He makes contested catches. And that was my favorite thing about Mac when I was watching him on film is this guy makes contested catches. And, you kind of make – there's kind of – I wouldn't say it's an old adage when you're watching film, but it's kind of one of those things where if a guy's making too many contested catches, I mean, what are you thinking? You're probably thinking, well, maybe he's not really getting open that much, right? Like, it's more important to get open than it is to make contested catches because you can make the argument that, well, maybe he should not be making as many contested catches because maybe he should be getting more separation and space from defenders. But he does actually separate really well from linebackers, and he uses his body really well too. I think the reason he wasn't getting separation is because, and I think one of the reasons that he also fell in this draft was because he had horrible quarterback play at Notre Dame. So Elise Mack is a guy who really kind of went under the radar because of bad quarterback play. But this guy is a natural receiving tight end. And I do think I know he's 7th-round pick. I know he's kind of, just by that, he's actually a long shot to even make the roster. But not only do I think Mack is going to make the team, I think he's going to be the 3rd best player from this draft class, this Saints draft class. And I think he's going to get maybe, I'm going to say 15, 20%, spot snaps as a rookie. I'll say 15 snaps a game, maybe on average. But this is a guy who could, if he's groomed properly like Jared Cook, if he's groomed properly by Cook, I think he's a guy who has the future to be the Saints tight end. And we know, just like you mentioned, we know the Saints put, they've been needing a good tight end for a long time. We tried to get one in Kobe Fleener. I think that Jared Cook will kind of be what we wanted Fleener to be, probably nothing more, but certainly he won't be as bad as Fleener. And Drew Brees has always shown an affinity for throwing the football to tight end. So I'm hoping that Elise Mack, he's kind of our dark horse here, and he's kind of a guy that really has the intangibles and the measurement and really the skill set to actually develop into at least a rotational receiving move tight end for the Saints. So I'm pretty excited about Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. I'm excited about Eric McCoy, and I'm excited about Elise Mack in this draft class. Let's move on. I know I've discussed a lot about the Saints draft picks here, but let's move on to our best question of the day here, and that is from Dr. Steve out of Covington, Louisiana, and he asked us, what do y'all make of the Kentucky Derby controversy? And we're going to mix it up here because, Michael, I was watching the Derby, and I was extra interested in this year because we did a fantasy draft order kind of determined by the Derby, where in my family league, the inverse order of standings got to see who got to pick their horse first, and there was no repeats. So like last year, not to call Carly out here, but Carly got last place last year. So she was able to pick her horse first, and it went on, et cetera, until the championship team got to pick their horse last. And by that point, it was like 50 to 1 odds, so it was a long shot. But it was just kind of a fun way to determine draft order that included some version of parity, but also, a lot of version of luck, of course. And I got to say, before we kind of talk about the Derby, this was a really fun and successful and highly recommended fantasy football draft idea for any of y'all out there. I know the Derby's over, but you can still do it for the Preakness and Belmont Stakes. But we had a blast with it, and that was, everyone in the league. We actually have 13 teams in that league. All 13 teams or owners were watching the Kentucky Derby, which I don't think was very common for them, and they were all rooting for it on this big group chat. And, when the controversy happened, it made it even more extreme. Carly, who got last, picked Maximum Security, which we'll get to in a second, was actually a really big deal because let's talk about the Derby real quick. There was just a little background here. There was a fascinating and unprecedented Kentucky Derby as Maximum Security, the favorite, was winning pretty much the whole race, and probably by about a length, I would say, and it was on a sloppy track, and he never really gave up the lead the entire race. And he crossed the finish line in first, and he won. And they interviewed the jockey and everything, and they were talking about his dreams coming true and everything like that, the whole shebang that they normally do. And about 4 minutes after the race was over, after all the interviews and praising everyone, there was an objection called by Country House, or the jockey that rode Country House. And this was the horse that finished in second. And the objection was that it was claiming Maximum Security left his lane and impeded other horses in contention, particularly War of Will. The horse there causing War of Will to slow down and then causing trickle-down effect, causing other horses after War of Will to slow down. And that Max Security should therefore be disqualified for the foul and ultimately giving the win to Country House, even though Country House himself wasn't actually affected by the lane violation. And the stewards, which are kind of the refs in this situation, spent about 23 minutes trying to make this call. And this is just very odd, not only because this has never happened before to a Kentucky Derby winner, but it was very odd, Michael, because the race itself, fastest 2 minutes in sports, right? It's only a 2-minute race. But the review took 23 minutes. Michael, you were there watching it with me. What were your impressions of the Derby, and what were your thoughts?
Well, it's kind of weird. So, I've actually been following horse racing since I was 18. So for about 10 or 11 years, I've bet on horse racing. I don't know the rules well enough to talk about whether or not it was a valid concern, if it's something that the horse just got spooked, it was an accident, whether or not it should have been called or whatever. I think the review taking 23 minutes, I'm happy with that. I think that's the way it should be. We've talked a lot about the NFL and their review system. The fact that, again, there's nothing waiting on this besides the results. So I think they should do that. I think they should spend that kind of time if it's that big of a decision to figure out what the right thing is. I mean, don't you?
Yeah, and this was a local podcast, so we got to talk about. I was seeing a fair number of tweets on my Twitter as this process was going on. I was trying to look on my Twitter for anyone who I followed who knew about horses and who could tell me the rule standard, which we'll get to in a second. But I noticed so many bitter Saints fans on my Twitter saying, "Oh, well, why couldn't they take time to review the pass interference call that cost us, a Super Bowl potentially?" But yeah, there was a lot of bitter Saints fans on there saying that actually were respecting the process, that the refs and the stewards were giving enough time to for the high stakes, right? I mean, these are huge stakes. You can't get any higher stakes in this. And I want to talk about a couple of sports arguments, if you will, Michael. And the first one was an NBA analogy here that Mike Tirico said, and I love Mike Tirico, he's so great at his job, and he gave a great analogy, and he said that in his experience, this seems to me like he kind of compared it to calling a foul in the first quarter of an NBA game as opposed to the exact same foul should it be called, in the fourth quarter of a NBA championship with the game on the line. Is it the same standard of fouls called? Because some refs kind of swallow the whistle kind of late in these games because they don't want to be the deciding factor. But, the argument, of course, is, if a foul is a foul, right? It shouldn't have a different standard depending on the stakes or when it happens in the game, right? What's your kind of take on this for the NBA? And do you think it's a pretty apt comparison for the Derby here?
I think it's a good comparison. I mean, it's funny. I actually want to go back to soccer because for me, if you ever played soccer, and you did, so you know this, but the things that happen on corner kicks, especially as you progress through high school soccer and college soccer, though, it's crazy what people do on corner kicks, and nothing is called. It's sort of nuts. Like, people are stepping on your toes. They're doing a lot worse things than that. I don't want to talk about what they are. But I think that if you look at even so let's say that, go back to the NBA, I think it's ridiculous that the standards aren't the same at any given point of the game. I mean, that influences behavior. So if you're saying that, and everybody knows this about the NBA, you get away with a lot more contact at the end of the game, like Tirico is saying. And I think that's ridiculous. And because players know that they won't call those things, it influences how they play. And I don't want the NBA games to end on a whistle the same way that anybody else would. But I think when you basically fundamentally change the rules for the last 2 minutes, for the last play or whatever, I think that sort of undermines the integrity of the game. I think you should keep it consistent all the way through.
Right. And there's no rule in the rule book that says, the rules are only talking about what the fouls are. So there's no rule in the rule book that says, you call them more loosely if the stakes are higher, right? Or it's later in the game, or if it's the playoffs, or for whatever reason. I want to touch on the soccer corner kick thing. Is a great comparison there, because I think one of the reasons that you could argue that the refs don't call it is because what happens because the result would be a PK, right? Because it's in the box. Yeah. So that would be a huge swing if they call kind of a ticky-tack foul, and some of them may be more than ticky-tack, but that's almost an automatic goal percentage-wise that they would be calling there. So I could kind of see them swallowing the whistle with that. But the NBA, it's a little different. You're right. It's a little. You want the refs more than anything to be consistent. You want the refs at the end of the game to say, they were calling it this way all game, so you as athletes should be able to adapt, because different ref crews are going to be different. Some are going to be more strict than others, but as long as it's consistent for me, I don't really mind it. I think the argument, and I'll go ahead and counter, I'll play devil's advocate here. I think the argument is that in a sport like this, kind of an obscure sport, if you will, the Kentucky Derby, you have, hundreds of thousands of people watching really horse racing this one time a year, right? So it's kind of like, now they finally are tuning in, and you finally have the people watching that you want, a national audience watching horse races this one time a year for a lot of them. And there's all this money on the line, right? So we got to mention the money, because the Kentucky Derby is one of the most bet things in all of sports. So with all that money on the line and all this it's not just the stakes of the Derby, but with all that audience watching him for the first time, it's almost like, is there any pressure, do you think, that they don't want to kind of make the sport so nuanced that they're calling like a ticky-tack kind of thing? It seems to me like it would be in horse racing's best interest to not call a foul unless it's really obvious.
I think it's really funny, the juxtaposition of what you were saying. So you're talking about how people don't know anything. They don't watch horse racing all year, and then they bet on the Derby. And then like the sort of level of knowledge about what's going on. It's kind of funny to me because that's exactly like what I would argue is that those people shouldn't be putting down a lot of money on something that they don't understand. I think that
right.
I think it has to be the right. To me, it's always about doing what's right. So I mean, if it's about giving the winner basically giving the person who deserves the win. So if the rules were broken to get that for someone else, I mean, to me, it's just what is objectively correct. The stakes shouldn't matter. I know that's kind of almost like an idealistic way of looking at it, but I think that it should be about the rules. It shouldn't, and the fact that like we're gonna be upset either way. So people are gonna be upset because something wasn't called because they didn't want to make that judgment call, or either way, someone's upset. So to me, just call it the right way and then just live with the ramifications.
Right, and you could even make the argument to build on top of that. You can even make the argument that because so many people have money on it, and because this is a national audience, that you want to get this, you want to explain how horse racing works. Like you want the audience to know the rules. Right. And I know that you can, I know the counter to that is you're kind of turning them off, like, because you're taking away from the race itself. But, you could easily make the argument that you want the national audience to understand that you can't, have these lane violations. And you also want people who are betting on this to, if that much money is on the line, then you want to make sure that the right horse won, right. That a horse didn't cheat to get that money, so you can't say it's rigged or anything like that. So, and it's kind of sad because we're guilty of this, and I think every news outlet is guilty of this, but we haven't even mentioned really that the winner, Country House, was a long shot at 65-1, and it was the second biggest upset ever and in the Kentucky Derby. And the controversy is kind of really overshadowing this fact. Like everybody's going to remember this as the maximum security. They're going to remember the name Maximum Security because that's the person who faulted. And they're going to remember this was the 2019 Derby was the Derby that they had this unprecedented, not cheating event, but lane violation. And nobody's really ever talking about right now that this was a massive upset win. I mean, a 65-1 long shot, right?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. And I mean, so with betting in particular, with horse racing, this is a really, really big field, which you'll see for stakes races and stuff like that. And that's what makes it so fun, right? It's very difficult to pick the winner, even if it's a favorite. So the favorites are typically a rule of thumb is that the favorites will win one of every three. So it's not like you're betting on a sure thing, no matter how good the horse is. I think people who might know horses better might argue differently, but that's sort of the general betting rule is that it's about a 1 in 3 chance of the favorite winning. So someone like this wins at 65-1. I mean, that the exacta was crazy, the trifecta was crazy. I think that kind of stuff is really fun, and I like that an underdog won. I think that's awesome.
Right. And I do want to, before we sign off, I want to clarify a couple of things just for the viewers who maybe either didn't watch the Derby or maybe thinking that we should have said this here. I know we're not horse experts, so I'm trying to not leave any stone unturned here. But it is worth noting, of course, that the track was sloppy. It's worth noting that the horse was in lane 2, and they ruled that the rear and the hind legs of the horse ended up getting to lane 4 when he bumped War of Will. And it's also worth noting the standard of review here because, Michael, when we were watching, they really didn't have a lot of smart analysis to say about, when we're watching basketball or football, they at least know the rule and they know what they're looking at. But here, the standard of review was never really clear. They were debating actually on the air whether, I wouldn't say debating, but they were confused at whether is the standard review, is there a foul? Like, did he have a lane violation? Which the answer upon review, upon looking at the different angles, was yes. Or was the standard review, did the foul impact the results of the race? And they were kind of confused on that. They even brought it to a rules guy, and they asked what the rules guy, he probably didn't think he was getting talked to at all the whole, for the race. But they brought the rules guy in, and he said that Max Security was the best horse, so he should win. And I was like, what kind of statement is that from a rules guy? That's not the rule, whoever the best horse is. And it's really funny though, Michael, because Donald Trump, that was Donald Trump's rule. Trump tweeted about this, and he said that the best horse did not win, not even close. And he basically thought that Maximum Security should have won. So, of course, Trump had something to say about this. So it turns out that the excuse that was given for the horse was that the horse was a quote-unquote baby, and he was spooked by the crowd, because when you make that turn, you kind of see the crowd. Real quickly, what are your thoughts on that kind of? I don't know if it was an excuse, but that kind of explanation for when it happened.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's okay. So there can be two things that could be simultaneously true, right? Like, he could have done something that was illegal unintentionally. Those are not. So in terms of that, I think it's possible that the horse did get spooked and he did go to the side, but that doesn't mean that the horse deserves to win. And like you had said about the analyst and Donald Trump and whoever, I mean, it doesn't matter who the best horse was if the horse that was the best did something that was cheating.
Cheated.
Yeah, I mean, and not, I guess cheating wouldn't even be the right word, but basically foul in the same way that, let's just say the best player in the world right now is still LeBron James. If LeBron James is in a game and he gets out of position and he fouls someone, just because he could defend someone 9 times out of 10 doesn't mean that he shouldn't be called for a foul when he does something that's against the rules. I mean, I think that's a ridiculous premise. And
so I think they were just a little shocked. And ultimately, my overall, when I was watching this for 23 minutes and they just weren't really clear on what was going on, my overall thought on this was that the NBC kind of seemed unprepared for this, right? Like, there was not a lot of clarity going on about what should really happen here. Not only did they not know if it was a foul, but they also didn't know the standard of review like we just talked about. So we'll part with this. Just in case y'all are wondering what we think about whether it was a violation. I did just some research on the rule. Here is the rule. It says, except in a straightaway racing, every horse must maintain position as nearly as possible in the lane in which it starts. If a leading horse or any other horse in the race swerves or is ridden to either side so as to interfere with or intimidate or impede any other horse or jockey, it is a foul. If a jockey strikes another horse or jockey, it is a foul. So here's the review right here. Here's the key right here. If, in the opinion of the stewards, a foul alters the finish of the race, any offending horses may be disqualified from the stewards. So the standard really was, it's not that he committed the foul. He could have committed the foul and still won. However, the stewards had to rule on whether the foul actually did impact the results of the race. And that was the standard review, and that's the key takeaway here. And they ruled that it was possible that War of Will or potentially, Country Horse or other horses could have won had not for the lane violation occurring.
I think there's a possibility the analyst was maybe saying when they said the best horse would win, the best horse should win or whatever. Maybe he was trying to say exactly what you just said, that basically he would have won regardless, and sort of referencing that rule without articulating it the right kind of way.
I definitely thought it was a foul. I really did. Now, I don't know if it affected the outcome of the race. Like that, I see why they took 23 minutes on it, and I wish there was more clarity. I mean, maybe it was just me being impatient because I was trying to get my fantasy draft order going on here, but I definitely think NBC was kind of unprepared and just it wasn't very clear what was really going on and what the standard was. But upon review, though, I did think it was a foul, and to be honest, I do think it impacted. It was less clear that it impacted the results of the race, but if I had to say, I would say yes. I do think it impacted the results of the race. So, yes, I actually agree with the decision for the stewards to overturn the call.
Fair enough.
All right, and that will do it for this week's local episode. We dove into a little horse talk there. Folks, again, I got to plug this. We got a great interview with Michael Maudie coming up. It'll be our next episode. You'll absolutely want to tune into that. Thank you so much for listening today. Make sure you become one of our best friends by subscribing to this podcast and giving us a great rating on iTunes. You can also follow us on all social media at Best Podcast NOLA. We'll be back next week. Tell all your friends. Who dat?